What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Colin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly with Philly Sports Talk. And there's a lot going on in the sports world. There's a lot going on in Philadelphia. The Eagles are back on track after winning 2 in a row. You got Sixers season starting up. You got a dream World Series matchup with the Dodgers and the Yankees. And I want to tell you a story toward the end of the show because it's the World Series. I'm going to play some sound of a pretty ridiculous story I got about Cliff Lee in the 2009 World Series at Yankee Stadium. But really, it's going to be a Flyers episode, and more specifically, a John Tortorella episode.
So the chain of events, if it was done right, we don't lose our goalie, we win the hockey game. So all this technology, right? The technology and getting things right, the stubbornness tonight by the officials and by the league and Toronto, however it's supposed to work, screws us.
John, do you think this has to be a physical series for your team to win or a fast series?
I think it's going to be a little of both. Right now, I don't know what the hell it is.
Don't put words in my mouth. Kiss my ass.
It's one of the most arrogant organizations in the league. They whine about this stuff all the time, and look what happened. But they'll whine about something else over there, won't they?
We'll probably beat up in the bus stop most of the time.
I think so, huh?
That sound courtesy of Sportsnet Canada, and that's what I knew about John Tortorella when the Flyers hired him a little over 3 years ago. I've also experienced some of this stuff on my own, too.
There are certain people that they don't have a clue how to play or just don't have it in them to play in these type of situations. Rest, this, that, the other thing. If you don't have enough balls to play in these type of games, rest doesn't do us any good.
I even got this treatment myself one time. When John Tortorella benched Tony DeAngelo 2 seasons ago, I asked him a question about it post-game. He looked at me as if I had just spit on his ancestor's grave. I had a teacher in high school use that analogy phrasing to me once. I've also seen the Kevin Hayes debacle, whatever that was in terms of misreporting after the Cutter Gauthier trade or confusion with what was actually said by the reporter. But I also knew before John Tortorella came to the Flyers that he was a good coach in Columbus. I also knew he won the Cup with the Tampa Bay Lightning in 2004. I remember the Flyers facing the Lightning in the Eastern Conference Final that year. That series went 7 games, and it was just so tight. I think we talked about it a few weeks ago in some of the greatest moments in Flyers captain history. Keith Primeau was the captain of that team. He had an excellent series. That Game 6 comeback that the Flyers had, one of the most electrifying hockey games I've ever seen. But John Tortorella is the one who won the Cup that year. He was a young coach just coming into his own. So he made his bones with the Lightning. He also kind of resurrected the Rangers a few years later. That stint wasn't as successful, but I still think he had a decent tenure in New York. So I was anxious to get down to the arena and see some excitement, if nothing else. It was a big-name coach. He's one of only a few coaches in NHL history ever to win the Jack Adams as the Coach of the Year multiple times. And since he's been here, Tortorella's kind of lived up to the reputation. He's rough around the edges. He's difficult to deal with. He's tough as nails. He can jump on you at any point and be really aggressive. And yeah, he can go over the top. All in all, as a hockey coach, I think he's done a great job with the Flyers, and I'll tell you why after the break.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I want to jump into certain misperceptions that I think some people had about John Tortorella. They've mostly been weeded out at this point. It's his 3rd season in Philadelphia. At least from what I hear most people talk about, I think they've been weeded out. But some things were oversimplified about his coaching style a couple years ago when the Flyers hired him. I think too many NHL coaches depend on veteran players. They're more comfortable falling back on veteran players than they are with taking a little bit of a risk, putting younger players on the ice who maybe are more skilled, but they don't have that grizzled hockey veteran type of game. I think people thought that about Tortorella, kind of assumed that he would be that type of coach. And I also think certain fans, with the personality style John Tortorella has, he'd be into the physical game, over-reliant on a checking style, the whole Broad Street Bullies bit, since it was the Flyers that hired him, maybe stuck in the past in terms of fighting. Not really. That hasn't come to fruition at all, actually. And this is not the indicators that people would have suspected. For the home opener of the 2024-25 season, Jamie Drysdale spoke about John Tortorella and the messaging he had gotten from him. And what Jamie Drysdale said, I think it's just such a microcosm of John Tortorella's time in Philadelphia. This is after giving up a terrible goal in a road game before the Flyers even got to the home opener to start the season.
How much is he letting you try to play to your strengths, you think?
Yeah, I think the main thing that he just keeps reinforcing and telling me is make a decision and go with it. Don't be in between. Trying to do that as much as I can. Yeah, I think I'm just looking to build each game and get better.
But how do you sort of reconcile that? Like, he tells you to go and play with grace, but then you don't want to give up the other way. He wants you to be, understanding of what the defensive responsibilities are. How do you kind of reconcile that either with yourself in your own game or when you talk to Bradshaw or Words?
I think that's part of the learning curve. Obviously, there's been a handful of mistakes, tough reads. I think that's just all part of learning and just getting a feel for it.
One more cherry-picking tendency that I had heard. Again, I think people are over this in a lot of cases, but they still said it when he first got hired. I think certain people expected Tortorella to be too defensive-oriented. And I disagree, because he handles his defensemen in such a different way that doesn't align with that philosophy at all. I think he wants the defenseman to be catalysts on offense because he's recognized over time how much the game has changed and how much NHL teams can benefit from transition offense, puck movers from the blue line being those catalysts that really get the forwards going. And with Jamie Drysdale, you heard him say, make a decision and go with it. Don't be in between. Tortorella wants him to make quick decisions, to be that kind of offensive catalyst. When they traded Cutter Gauthier for him, the Flyers thought of Drysdale, or at least they said publicly that they thought of Drysdale as a top pair defenseman. They didn't really use him that way through the remainder of his first season after the trade, but that's also got a lot to do with injuries and just kind of a lack of rhythm overall. So with Drysdale's first full season in Philadelphia, he's been getting time on the first power play unit, so the Flyers are looking for him to make that big step forward. But I think this is just one more example of how Tortorella is not some stubborn old man who's never transitioned to the modern game. He's shown enough openness to change, both with the Flyers and before he came to the Flyers. I have been able to talk to people in Columbus and also Vancouver, two of his previous stops, about him. I think this aligns with what he did in the other markets before he came to the Flyers. And I think his biggest strength as a coach in the last couple of seasons has been the way he's handled the young players. He's approached their maybe fragile mindset in the new age culture of professional sports, the modern athlete, as a lot of people like to say. He's approached it well with a strict disciplinarian style. Yes, that's what he's famous for. But he's also approached it with an effective job to get the most out of players. Think about Owen Tippett. John Tortorella has said so many times on the record that he wants Owen Tippett to really break through his own ceiling. He said at one point that Tippett will decide himself how good he wants to be. He's challenged him to be a power forward and really take the game into his own hands. Because I think at some points after Florida drafted him, when he was in that organization, he kind of hesitated, maybe stayed on the outside of the offensive zone, looking to just snipe At least that was his reputation. I think Tortorella has really reversed that since he got to Philadelphia and started working with Owen Tippett. Another guy to think about, Tyson Forster. In the 23-24 season, Forster made the team out of camp, and he was kind of snake bit at the beginning of the season. He wasn't putting up points, but Tortorella showed a lot of patience with him. He really likes Forster's all-around game for a good reason. Forster's good at winning puck battles. He can drive play at 5-on-5. He does some things that you see in all-around players, a lot of times all-around veteran players. So Tortorella was willing to give him a little bit of a longer leash than he has for certain other players who aren't putting up points offensively. Forster had a much better second half on the score sheet. He went through that goal streak and ended up having 20-plus goals as a rookie. Third guy I wanted to mention was Cam York. So there was drama the first year John Tortorella took over the Flyers with Cam York. He was expected to make the roster out of camp. He was expected to play a major role on D as one of their top guys. John Tortorella sends him to the AHL, challenges him to play for the Phantoms. He believed that York wasn't attacking the game enough. Maybe he got a little bit too comfortable as a former first-round pick, somebody who kind of expects to be a star in the NHL. So he challenged him. He said, can you handle time in the AHL? Because this is a developmental league, after all. And what he did to Cam York, at least at this point, seems to have worked out for the best. York has developed into a steady defensive player who's reliable in his own zone. He's good in the neutral zone, and he can drive play a little bit. You still might want to see him develop offensively if you're the Flyers. He hasn't put up a ton of points, so maybe he'll reach a ceiling on that one over time. But Cam York has absolutely improved under John Tortorella. It's just a question of the extent of his improvement. Now, Jamie Drysdale is one of the big ones in the 24-25 season. Danny Briere, in his press conference before training camp, forget who asked this question again, but Briere named Drysdale as one of the guys that he's looking to take that big jump, like Cam York did or Tyson Forster did. And this organization has put a lot of trust in John Tortorella to get the most out of these players that way. They think that he can identify the players who have that something inside them, that real grit, determination to get to the next level. Because remember, in the previous regimes, I guess two before the current one, really the Ron Hextall regime, a big problem was player development. You have Travis Konechny, who's panned out as a draft pick. I guess you could say Travis Sanheim also. But a lot of the draft picks from the Ron Hextall era, like Ivan Provorov, Nolan Patrick especially. I guess you could throw Carter Hart in there, even though that's a little bit of a different circumstance. But the player development path wasn't very good, and those guys didn't end up being the key contributors that people thought they were, that the Flyers expected them to be when they drafted those guys. But they trust their new coach, Tortorella, to develop players, to especially mentally, just to challenge them to be the best they can be, to get the most out of them. And you'll hear a ton of Tortorella's former players really harp on that. He pushes his own players to try to get the most out of them. Can't even tell you how many times I've heard that phrase. One example of a player that he had an interesting relationship, though, Zach Werenski of the Columbus Blue Jackets. He gave Werenski a lot of freedom, and the word he used was roamer on the blue line. Roamer, like an offensive defenseman who almost can have that freedom to leave his spot so often that it's going to be an offensive catalyst. So to use that word, I mean, that really reverses the narrative that I talked about a few minutes ago, that he's a defense-only coach. No, I think that shows the open mind to try new things and think about developing that offensive catalyst. So if Tortorella can do a similar thing with Jamie Drysdale, I think it'll be good for his long-term development. And Briere's also said on the record, this is the topic everybody wants to know about, that Matvei Michkov will benefit from having maybe just one, but we'll see how many seasons under Tortorella, because the original timeline for Michkov to come over probably didn't include any time working with this head coach. And that also might be a little bit of an indicator as to how long Tortorella is going to stay behind the bench. A front office move seems to be in his future. Just logically, it seems to make too much sense to ignore. But in the meantime, he is going to coach Michkov. He is going to get this guy's feet wet in the NHL. And I think Drysdale is ultimately going to be one of the key swing pieces. When you look back at Tortorella's tenure as a coach with the Flyers, you're going to say, well, how did this guy develop? Jamie Drysdale is one of the ones who hasn't yet. So it's going to be an important part of maybe the judgment of his overall time with the Flyers, of Tortorella's overall time, that is, not Drysdale's. But you have a curious case here with the head coach. He's very polarizing. He's in the news all the time. And before I move off the Tortorella thing, I want to acknowledge that it kind of seems like people, when they talk about Tortorella, tend to go one way or the other. They think this unorthodox, fiery, hard-nosed style is either great or terrible. That's the way polarizing head coaches work. That's kind of the way the year 2024 works also. I'm kind of on both sides on him, though. So people like to say there's a long track record with him, and I get why. He had 7 years with Tampa. I think it was about 5 with the Rangers and then 6 with Columbus. And he's fit well with the Flyers. I've even heard an interesting comparison. How about a college football coach looking to build a program back up, a once great program that slipped, but it's still a high-profile job? That's pretty much the Flyers, and that's what Tortorella's doing in Philadelphia. It seems like a pretty good fit for that. But the same people would also say they realize it didn't work out in Vancouver. Tortorella spent only 1 season in Vancouver, and things blew up. It was an example of his volatility, and you saw that same volatility at the end of last season. So when you're evaluating track records, for the most part in professional sports, if you have 4 instances of previous stops and 3 of them worked out really well and 1 of them didn't, yeah, maybe you say you do go with the 3 because it's a much larger chunk of Tortorella's career. But you can't ignore that 4th. And things did not go well in Vancouver. He didn't really mesh well with Daniel and Henrik Sedin. His style didn't really appeal to them as players. It didn't utilize their strengths. You had some blow-ups on the bench, and nothing ever really got off the ground. He actually didn't even live in Vancouver at the time. He lived below the U.S. border, which I heard from a writer out there. Just a little bit of a strange situation. But I have admittedly not become familiar with the Vancouver, British Columbia area. So that's another topic to unravel. But think about last season. Think about the 23-24 Flyers. Tortorella didn't deliver the right message at the end of that season. The players didn't respond to all the craziness that was going on in the organization. The Flyers had a stranglehold on a playoff spot toward the end of the season, and they handed it away. They had an 8-game losing streak, and a lot of games during that streak were against poor teams that finished towards the bottom of the league. Don't forget that. Even though he did a great coaching job, I think he would have won another Jack Adams had they actually made a wild card spot. But his coaching style was a very big reason why the team folded so much at the end. He was pushing the players really hard. He said on the record that he wanted to show them how big the moment was and to give them that challenge, kind of like he did to Cam York when he sent him to the AHL. Realize that this is the big time. Have them arrive in the moment. It didn't work. It failed. He scratched Sean Couturier, sat his captain as a healthy scratch, probably to send a message to the team to wake people up. Nobody's actually landed on that because, Tortorella does tend to be pretty secretive about his relationships with players, as most coaches are, but I think most people can infer that that's what he was trying to do, send a message and wake up the locker room. I think it kind of did the opposite. But this is the volatility that you get with the John Tortorella experience. Could all of this end in a job in the front office? Maybe that's ultimately his mark on the organization. It's part of the rebuild, this whole new era of orange thing, that they think John Tortorella is reestablishing Flyers culture. He's the guy down there on the daily grind that is trying to get them back to where they need to be mentally. Because this rebuild has had probably more of an emphasis on culture than any organization's direction that I've ever heard, actually. The top-end talent thing, or lack of top-end talent, was probably the biggest concern heading into the Danny Briere and Keith Jones regime. I think they might have even put more of an emphasis on rebuilding the organization's culture. It's a subjective concept. Not saying it's a meaningless concept, but I'm saying a lot of times it can be overemphasized in professional sports. The reason that the Flyers have succeeded a little bit more than other organizations have with trying to have culture make an impact, I think it's because of Tortorella. I think it's because of how he has tangibilized some of these things, the grit, and applied them to this team, to a bunch of young players who maybe someday will be part of a Stanley Cup contender. And he's tried to instill that in the team, build it from the ground up, even if this Flyers roster isn't aligning with a typical rebuild necessarily, at least not the template that the Sixers laid out with the process, which seems to be everybody's go-to template for any professional sports rebuild. John Tortorella is a peculiar guy, though. My friend Bob Cooney used to say he's intriguing, kind of like a mystery. But the long and short of it, he's one of the best head coaches from a content standpoint. He's exciting, never a dull moment with this guy. He's effective. He's got a great NHL track record, 1 Stanley Cup, 2 Jack Adams, and a bunch of success along the way. And he does give the media a lot, whether you realize it or not. It might not be after games, and he might not be reasonable all the time. If you just search his name on YouTube or rewind back to the beginning of this episode, actually, he's not going to be reasonable all the time. But he gives the media a lot, especially after practices. Occasionally, you'll see him just stay up at the podium for like 10, 15 minutes and just keep going with insight. And it's very enjoyable and informing to listen to. The guy's a great hockey mind. He's got a lot to offer the Flyers, and in a weird way, he's got a lot to offer the media. I'm going to take a second break this week and talk baseball when I come back. It is the World Series, whether or not the Phillies made it. It's Yankees-Dodgers, which is like a media dream, by the way. All it does is make me remember that the Phillies could have faced the New York Mets, the LA Dodgers, and the New York Yankees on the path to a World Series. New York, LA, New York. Oh, God, there's some media attention that I could have jumped in on. But we'll take a positive spin. I'll give you one of the wildest stories you'll ever hear about Cliff Lee.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. And I got a story for you. It's from the Darren Dalton golf outing, where there was a ton of Phillies alumni. But the best story I got didn't come from a player. Nope, this story came from Frankie Kopenbarger, who was the Phillies director of team travel and clubhouse services and a veteran of MLB Clubhouse really a wealth of knowledge and stories just about the game of baseball in general. And I actually had heard this story one time, and I knew he had told it on the record before I asked about it. But to set the stage, the Phillies had won the World Series in 2008. They come back in 2009 with Cole Hamels as their ace coming off that World Series MVP, but he kind of went in the tank that 2009 season. He really slipped up. The Phillies go out in July and get Cliff Lee. There was all types of speculation about Roy Halladay coming to Philadelphia, but that hadn't happened yet. That was during the ensuing offseason. But when Cliff Lee got to Philadelphia, he really started killing it. And especially in the postseason, Hamels was fading even worse. And Cliff Lee was really that workhorse, that one guy that the Phillies were counting on to carry them through October. So they get to their second straight World Series, going to face the New York Yankees, this spectacle. They're going to go up to Yankee Stadium for the Fall Classic, and they're going to start Cliff Lee in Game 1, this red-hot pitcher who was looked unhittable at certain points during the playoffs. And for the most part, he was. He shut down the Yankees' attack. It was a 6-1 win for the Phillies. Cliff Lee pitched a complete game. He let up one run, and it was unearned. They beat CC Sabathia, who was the Yankees' ace that season. And one of the things that I think Phillies fans remember most, the little lazy pop fly he caught at Yankee Stadium. He looked like he didn't even care that he was in the World Series. Took the ball, and about a second later, he was back on the mound, pitching very nonchalant demeanor that kind of endeared him to Philadelphia. Then 2 innings later, he had that backhanded grounder, and I think that was kind of the point where Cliff Lee entered Phillies folklore, and everybody just loved his approach to the game, how he was not under pressure. He was cool, calm, collected. Well, they might have seen that as a good thing at the time, how he wasn't feeling the pressure, how he wasn't stressing about pitching in Game 1 of the World Series. However, that almost backfired in the craziest sort of way. Frankie Koppenbarger told a pretty interesting story about that night. And we came across a funny nugget at the Fanatic last week that I was hoping to bring up to you. Phillies fans love to laugh about that game where Cliff Lee started Game 1 of the World Series, catching that pop-up. Can you tell fans why that almost never happened?
Well, yeah, I'll make it as brief as I can, but he nearly missed the game. It's not uncommon for a pitcher to come late to the ballpark on the days they start, but honestly, they don't do that in the postseason. But Cliff did, and he underestimated rush hour traffic in New York City. He called me, I think it was probably about 6:15, and I believe the game probably started around 8:15. And he was on 80th Street, stuck in a taxi cab, not moving. So I suggested he find a police officer and tell him who he was and that they would undoubtedly run him out there in a police car. Well, he tried for a few minutes and then lost patience with that and ended up getting on the subway with all the fans. I don't think anybody knew who he was, nor would they expect him to be there either. He asked me to tell Charlie Manuel he might not be there. You better get somebody else ready to pitch. You couldn't pay me enough money to do that. I went and found Rich Doobie, the pitching coach, broke the news to him. But neither one of us had to tell Charlie. He finally got there, and all was well.
So Cliff Lee almost missed Game 1 of the World Series because he hit traffic. There would have been no lazy pop fly, no backhanded grounder, no complete game. That was probably the high point of that series, though. The Phillies did end up losing to the Yankees in 6 games. But you had that moment of euphoria where the Phillies took a 1-0 lead in the World Series as the defending champs, and it looked like they had a great chance to repeat. Cliff Lee was a fan favorite while he pitched. Things are a little different now, but people absolutely loved him back then, and that game is one of the biggest reasons why. How absurd would it be if Cliff Lee didn't start that game? This had disaster potential. Imagine being stuck in New York traffic, not moving, trying to get to Yankee Stadium, and the cab driver doesn't know who you are. You're telling him, no, I'm starting starting game 1 for the Phillies shortly. I just can't imagine how these conversations would have gone down. And he calls the traveling secretary for the team and asks him to tell the manager that he might not be there on time to start game 1 of the World Series. Can you imagine how that conversation would have gone down? I love that Frankie told Rich Doobie before he had the courage to go up to Charlie Manuel. And it was funny how lighthearted he was talking about Charlie and the way he would have responded to that. But ultimately, they didn't have to go to Charlie Manuel. This situation resolves itself because he got on the subway. So Yankees fans are probably riding the subway to the game. This is shortly before first pitch. And Cliff Lee's right next to them. And it's weird how people think, because Frankie said they wouldn't have expected him to be there, so they didn't recognize him. It's weird how public figures don't get that recognition in situations where you really wouldn't expect to see them. So I believe it. I believe that there were a ton of Yankees fans there and maybe even thinking, nah, that couldn't be Cliff Lee. Why would he be on the subway just a little bit before game time? But Cliff Lee ends up arriving at Yankee Stadium just in time to pitch game 1, and he threw one heck of a game, avoiding that disaster potential that I was talking about. I mean, this could have been one of the most infamous stories in Philadelphia sports history, right up there with like Ben Simmons or J.D. Drew. Rest on that one, Philadelphia. I'm Colin Newby, and this is First Time, Long Time.